now a session to kind of make you aware of a couple of the dangers and pitfalls of loudness processing and loudness work. It's been now on the, on our agenda, loudness, for several years now, at least 3 years. So I think it's about time to, maybe uncover a couple of mysteries or misunderstandings, or make you aware of issues that you might have not, taken into account as much as you should. I, bring you this picture again of the different areas, and I would like to focus now mainly on the broadcaster's side. There are many other, issues with the other regions, and we have speakers here who will tell you about the other systems and the dangers and pitfalls, but I will mainly focus on the broadcaster side now because this is also the area of my experience, basically. A word about the algorithm itself. We have, as you know, 1770. We've talked about it, and we see this K-weighting curve at the center of the algorithm. There are a couple of implications with this quite, simple high-pass filter that you can encounter in practice. And one of those is if you have a program with a male voice as the commentary, for instance, that has a lot of low-frequency content. Due to the fact that we have this, high-pass filter, a very low male voice will end up sounding louder despite you have the same measurement, because all these low frequencies are attenuated in the loudness measurement. That is an effect we see in practical terms now, that, male speakers with a lot of low-frequency content can actually sound a little bit louder. That's not 5 dB, of course, or 5 LU, but 1 or 2 LU louder despite the same number. That can happen. So if that happens, don't be surprised. It's because of the way the loudness filter works. The downside of this is, of course, that especially commercial broadcasters discover that very quickly, and advertisement companies. And we see now in Europe, increasingly, at least in the countries that have started to normalize commercials, that, bass levels are being pushed, because the measurement is not as susceptible to bass frequencies as to mid frequencies and high frequencies. Which, by the way, is also one of the reasons why in a 5.1 environment, in the EBU, we would like to have the LFE also measured, which is now not measured. So the potential is there to abuse the LFE, to abuse, the low end. So that's one thing you might look at as far as the algorithm itself is concerned. A couple of sentences to gating. As you know, gating was established by EBU R128, by the EBU group, for the pure purpose to help to balance dynamic content better. If you measure a highly dynamic feature film, the low-level parts will bring the measurement down, so you will have to raise the whole program too much. So dynamic feature films were too loud without additional measures. That's why we established the gating method. That's the only reason why we did that. And there are a couple of points which you have to take into account, or which phenomena that might occur, which you thought, well, that's really strange. The gating solution is now a relative gate of 10 LU below the ungated one. That's what we call the G10, and it's a part of the international standard of 1770-2. One issue, of course, is do you really use the latest version of 1770? And of course, in Europe, we have updated R128 and all our documents to reflect the new gating method. But for instance, in the recommended practices A85, it's a little bit different. They, in some points, refer specifically to the version without the gate, and in another part, they refer to the latest version of 1770. So you have to look into that, what really is appropriate. Whereas the gating solution only really will make a difference when you have highly dynamic programming. On your average, 90% of what you transmit, usually gating won't make a big difference. The differences are there between 0 and 1 LU, so really very low for a news program would make no difference at all. But for a highly dynamic feature film, gating or no gating will easily give you a difference of 3, 4, 5 LU for highly dynamic material. So there it does make a difference, definitely. One thing with the gate is also that there is a phenomenon that you actually might raise a level, but get a lower number in the reading. And why is that the case? Imagine, a commercial, 20 seconds, where you have, occasional speech and you have some background noise. And if the background noise, the atmosphere, is below the gate, the measurement algorithm only measures, the foreground loudness of the speech. So you get a certain number. And if you then raise the background atmosphere and the noise to be just above gate threshold, then suddenly this atmosphere, gets measured and it's lower in level than the speech, so it will bring the measurement down because suddenly it's calculated. It's above gate threshold. So you raise your background noise, but the number gets lower because it suddenly is calculated. That's a phenomenon that is, that's because of the gate, the nature of the gate. How high is that phenomenon? Potentially something like 1 or 2 LU. So you could actually raise the background music or the background noise to be just above gate threshold, and it'll bring your level down if you have several parts that are only this low-level sound, then it will bring the measurement down. So if you encounter that, it's the nature of the gate. And of course, commercial broadcasters would want to use that, bringing the background sounds and music just above gate threshold so that the measurement comes down, and then they can push the whole thing a little bit more. But the phenomenon is also in the region of 1 to LU maximum. So you really have to kind of, craft your spot, your program in a way that this can be really used. I think in practical terms, it might be a slight problem in advertisement because there you really probably will try every trick of the trade to raise 1 LU or more. In regular programming, nobody will look at that. You just do it for aesthetic purposes, the level of your background sound and your background mixes, and you don't think about these issues. But just for short programming, if you encounter that, you raise something and the number goes down, that's because something suddenly is above the gate. That's the reason. Okay, that was just before I want to focus on the main areas of the dangers and pitfalls. 3 areas I have here to tell you. One is the target level itself, then the loudness range parameter, highly misunderstood in many instances, so I want to focus a little bit on that one. And last but not least, also the issues of installing a loudness processor at the output of master control. So target level first. As you know, in Europe we have this target level of minus 23 LUFS. In the US it's minus 24 LKFS, which is even closer than you think, because gating and non-gating brings those two numbers closer together. In any way, we have it around minus 23. But there has been some misunderstanding reading R128 that program loudness of minus 23 means that everything has to be at minus 23 all the time, that the program has to look like this. And of course that's not true, and you know that, but so that you have some weaponry, for if you are in discussions, it does not mean that, the program has to be at target level all the time. On the contrary, the opposite is correct. We encourage dynamic mixing, but it's the averaged, it's the integrated number. So the target level or program loudness of 23, the short term, the momentary loudness can go wild if you think that is okay for your target audience. That's always something you have to bear in mind, is the kind of environment that your program is listened to, is that capable of accepting the kind of range that you present. And Phil has elaborated on that sometimes it's just too much. And we have a measure for that, and I'll come to that. So this is, of course, not how it should look like. Yeah? Of course, target level of 23, the average, here the average is 23, but all the rest is 23 too. Yeah. So to have this kind of loudness sausage, as you would call it, I think is certainly a mistake. Yeah? So don't make a loudness sausage. Okay. So it's the average, it's not momentary, that can go really wild. For instance, like here, that would be your program, if you have a comparison here in the Dolomites, that would be momentary loudness. That would be a fantastic, highly dynamic program. And the average then would be minus 23. That's program loudness. That is how loud is the program on average. Yeah? That's what the target level means, and that's what program loudness means. Another issue is we should try not to confuse now the engineers, the poor engineers that are venturing in this world. We have a load of new abbreviations here now, like loudness level K weighting, momentary, short-term, integrated. We have the maximum true peak level. We have loudness range, maximum momentary loudness, maximum short-term loudness. So we could say this is now our revenge to the video guys, because we have now a lot of new abbreviations which nobody will understand from the video side. I remember that in the EBU, when I first was in Geneva at a EBU conference, there was a video guy who spoke only in abbreviations, and didn't explain any one of them. And I sat there and said, this is just impossible. Now, this is our revenge, But beware, if you give this kind of sheet to your audio engineer and say, well, LK has to be around -23, MTPL below -3, loudness range below 20, maximum momentary not more than +8 LU, etc., he will be totally confused. So I think what we have to ensure is that we are not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. The main issue is use your ears and not be in a cage of too many new parameters that have to be within a certain area. So we're coming from QPPM, which was difficult enough to judge loudness range and true peak level, and now we're coming into a world where we are suddenly in a cage of 5, 6 parameters that we should stick to, and of course the poor audio engineer is totally confused. So I think we should be careful not to confront the guys with too much information, too much new information now, because the issue is if you trust your ears and you use your ears, it'll be all fine. It'll all be okay. Once you have established your adequate listening level, where you can ensure that your average is around -23, then let go of the meter. Don't look at the meter anymore. Just trust your ears and everything will be okay. That's my message here. Don't overcomplicate things here. Because otherwise, your guys will look at you like this. What? What? Not with me. Anyway, loudness range now. Loudness range is an interesting topic. I have recently read an article also in a British magazine called Sound on Sound that tried to take the parameter loudness range to prove that in pop music, dynamics have actually not been worse over the years. And that can be highly dangerous to use loudness range for that. What is loudness range? You could call it as a kind of bird's eye view on your whole program. To look at it from the top to establish where are the main loud parts of my mix and where are the main soft parts of my mix, the macro dynamics. It doesn't look at micro dynamics. It doesn't look at the relationship of my loudness level to the peak level, because loudness range is based on the 3-second short-term measurement. So it really takes longer blocks into account and gives this kind of bird's eye view over your program. It does not mean the difference between the loudest and the softest part. That's technical dynamic range. But loudness range really looks at your mix and establishes, okay, here are your loud parts on average, here are your soft parts on average, and what is the distance in between those? So exactly what the consumer at home perceives as, okay, how much do I have to adjust the volume with the remote control if it's too much? It takes the average loud parts and the soft parts and judges it, the consumer, and then makes his decision. That's what loudness range is about. So you could actually maybe compare it with a thermoscan, like here, where you have hot parts of the body and cold parts of the body, and it wouldn't be the range between the hottest and the coldest, but for instance, between the average hot and the average cold one. By the way, if you look carefully, this is a very interesting one because the coldest part is here, up here. So it might be the producer of Metallica, or whatever. Very, very strange. Or if you look at a house, for instance, loudness range would be something like here are the average cold parts, here are the hot parts, and that would be loudness range in the thermoscan or temperature range. Not the biggest, the coldest one is up here, and the hottest one is up here. That will be technical dynamic range, yeah? So loudness range kind of gives you where are the average hot and cold parts of a program. In more technical terms, loudness range is calculated with statistical means, of course. Here you see, for instance, the loudness distribution of The Matrix, a film you've probably all seen, where the higher the point on the curve is, the more often the respective loudness value occurs during the whole film. So this is a statistical evaluation of the whole movie, The Matrix. So here we have one part, which is loudness levels between -30 and -38 LUFS, which occur most often in the movie, and that's, of course, all the dialogue. And that means that Matrix is quite a soft movie. It's not very loud as far as dialogue is concerned. And if you remember Matrix, they speak with a quite moderate voice most of the times, and it shows here in the distribution that these are the most frequent levels, and they are between -30 and -38, quite low. Then there's another chunk here of the louder parts that are probably the action scenes, a little bit more of the action scenes. And now the extremes of this distribution are eliminated to give this kind of average look at the macro dynamics, and the rest then is the number loudness range. That's what it's all about and how it's calculated. And in case of Matrix, it's 25 LU, for instance. We measure it in dB or LU and without plus or minus in 25 LU. And now we just recommend in R128, that's what also Phil said, we cannot immediately solve it with R128, but we just provide the tool and the means for the broadcaster to decide whether the result of a loudness range measurement is okay for the listener or not. And if you can ensure that your program is listened to in a certain environment for the majority of listeners, then you, of course, can tailor the loudness range to that environment. So if you are a radio broadcaster and you know that all your audience is listening in the car, then, of course, you can tailor it, and loudness range then is maybe 3 LU for your program, because you know background noise is so loud that you won't be able to transmit 10 LU radio. If you know your premium movie channel, for instance, that your audience primarily listens to in a home theater, then you can say, okay, my loudness range maximum is 25 LU, because they will accept that. And so you can use the parameter to decide whether the macro dynamics of your program are adequate for your target audience or not. And you can establish your own value for different genres and for different distribution platforms. That's kind of the idea behind loudness range. It does not give you a measure of the micro dynamics, the difference between loudness and peak. That's not what it can do. It's never intended for that. And it's also intended for long-form programming. So loudness range won't work or won't give you reasonable numbers for a 5-second commercial or for a 10-second commercial even, because it's based on the 3-second measurements. So for a 5-second commercial, you have 2 measurements. What does that mean? Nothing. So loudness range is really working from half a minute onward. Then it starts to give you reasonable numbers. But it's for long-form programming, this kind of bird's eye view. That's what loudness range is for. Yeah. For instance, let's look at those 2 cases. We have this program, which obviously is highly compressed music, for instance, which has a lower level verse or bridge in the middle that still is compressed, but it's lower. And then we have this program, which is very constant as far as the average loudness is concerned, but microdynamically, it's much better. It has a lot of transients, and it probably sounds much nicer. So if we now measure loudness and loudness range, in the first part, we will get a certain number of loudness range because we have loud parts and we have soft parts here. And in the second part, we get also, of course, a loudness value which is very constant, and therefore we get a loudness range calculation that is very small number. So in that case, number 1 has a higher loudness range than number 2. Despite the fact that number 2 probably sounds much better because it has dynamics, microdynamics. And that's the mistake that the journalist from that Sound on Sound magazine has done. He used loudness range to prove something that he was investigating on the microdynamic scale. And that's the wrong measure. Yeah? So be aware of this pitfall of using loudness range for something it is not intended to do or cannot do. And last but not least, the loudness processor issue. That's currently quite a main focus we are establishing in EBU P-Loud, because we see now first installments at broadcasters and how it works. There is this big kind of tag that the loudness processor is R128 compliant. And you have to be really careful with that, what is meant by that and what a processor can actually do to be R128 compliant. Because there are a couple of dangers here. And one, of course, is that there is too much processing being done. So, of course, it needs experts to tweak all the parameters. And the other potential danger is that it's in the signal chain all the time. Also for already compliant material that has been normalized to -23, and where the processor, does, of course, not know that, or at least it should know that. We'll come to that later. So those are the two dangers: too aggressive processing and in the signal chain all the time. There are broadcasters who have a loudness processor now in the signal chain all the time already. So we'll come to that. If you do that, then it can be the case that compliant material is too low after the processor. Just take a highly dynamic feature film, and there is a 5-minute action scene in the middle of the movie that is 10 LU louder, or let's say 5 LU, 6 LU louder than the average. The loudness processor cannot know that this is intended, and it just sees it's too loud now and starts to bring the level down. So, if a couple of scenes like that occur in the film, the loudness processor will more or less gradually, depending on the aggressiveness of how it's programmed, bring those loud levels down, which can lead to the fact that after the processor, if you measure the program loudness again, the program loudness is 3, 4, up to 5 LU lower than the original target level. So if you don't take care, originally R128 compliant material can end up considerably lower after the loudness processor than before. And that is actually a big problem that has been examined now also in the Netherlands, and has the opposite effect of what we want to achieve in loudness, that when they started to establish that, commercials really became more dynamic, or got more dynamic. Yeah, that was how we envisioned it, and it started to become like that. Then this phenomenon kicked in that one broadcaster had a processor in aggressively working on the material all the time. And those commercials that had expanded dynamic range suddenly ended up 3 LU lower after the processor. And the advertisers, of course, did not like that at all. And so they started to compress again and to make a -23 sausage out of it, because then they knew the processor would not do anything to their programs. So they delivered again the sausage. And that's exactly what we do not want. We encourage dynamics, and suddenly, because of these issues, that you are not ensuring that compliant material does not get processed, you end up with this situation, and everything gets down back again to compressed things. That's exactly what we do not want. So please be aware of that and ensure that if you use EBU mode, if you do R128 compliant programming and signal chains, that you do really ensure that your processor is really doing the right thing, and that it's hopefully automatically switched to bypass when compliant material is there. We are now in the process of establishing test signals actually for processors in P-Loud. So not only for EBU mode meters, but also for processors, so that they really can, then offer an R128 compliant preset, a preset that is compliant. It doesn't mean that the whole processor is automatically compliant, because it can have other presets that do other things that are more aggressive, that you need for external feeds where you have no clue what comes along and where you need to be a little bit tighter with your processing. But that is not then an R128 compatible preset in our sense, because we demand that the loudness range is not touched too much. Because, of course, the easiest way would be to make sausage. It's then -23, yeah, fantastic. It's R128 compliant. But that's not what we want. If a loudness processor really treats a signal, then it should at least, leave a certain loudness range that we could call it R128 compliant. And we're currently working on these test signals, so look out for that if you buy a loudness processor. And we have a few manufacturers here who will talk to you about their products and about the way to treat them. Be aware of these issues, and watch for the space in EBU for test signals of compliant products and compliant presets. Because the solution is to automatically switch those processes in bypass when you know that compliant material comes along. Yeah. That's really a quite vital point and can be easily done in automation systems, that you set a flag that just fires off a GPI contact to switch the processor in bypass. So you really should think about a total solution, not one box fits all, but a total solution of the issue. That's something that is very high on our agenda now, because the dangers to end up again in loudness sausage are quite high currently, as we see that. So, yeah, are we still there in the loudness nirvana? Not really. We are still having a couple of things that are out of whack to solve for the pure consumer, but I think we are on a very good route. Now it's really time to dig into the details, because, as you know, the devil lies in the detail. And with that, I think it's time for, finally make us smile again, and for the coffee break. Thank you.